This notable pang of research grief surfaced early in my seminary career during a Women in Church History and Theology class. Though I was several courses into my Master of Divinity program, I was new to exploring the topics of women and people of color as they pertain to theology. The dominating culture had yet to invite me to see myself and my culture within God's story. But I thank Creator for my stubbornness, for my combative spirit, which the dominating culture has deemed too much. Muy fresca. When I began this course, I was attending my second seminary. I had left the first one only months prior, after tussling with professors and pastors and experiencing firsthand the demons of sexism and racism. I admit being raised in an immigrant Roman Catholic community and then transitioning to Protestantism as an adult left me unfamiliar with the ins and outs of evangelicalism. Not only was I blissfully ignorant of what I was stepping into spiritually, but as a Cuban American born and raised in a city predominantly made up of Cuban Americans, I had yet to wrestle with my cultural identity in a majority non-Hispanic, white context. I was sitting in my hermeneutics class at the first seminary I attended when I realized I needed to leave. It was a difficult day. As the professor taught us how to engage interpretation week after week, it became clear that he wasn't speaking to me. The lens from which he taught and from which he encouraged us to engage was his own, of course. He was born and raised on a small farm in the rural South, so the context from which he understood the world was such, and the way he taught us to engage Scripture reflected this reality too. I remember constantly feeling like nothing he taught about the world, life, or the Bible related to me. I grew up in a large Latina city where I danced salsa on the weekends and greeted strangers with a kiss on the cheek. I was conceived and born out of wedlock, and I lived the first part of my life in a small apartment with my single mother in La Saguacera, the southwest portion of Miami, where I owned my first fake ID at 16. These details made me feel tainted, like I didn't belong. Was I not domesticated or pure enough? Did the reality of my life, experiences, and worldview make me too much or position me too far from understanding and knowing God the way I was supposed to? Trying to learn how to do the work of interpretation within a rural Southern framework only made me feel further from God and made me feel like my experiences, community, and culture were only getting in the way of my being able to understand the Bible. As a newer evangelical, I was told that shame was no longer mine to bear. But how could I not feel shame as a Latina woman trying to fit the mold of whiteness? Activist Julia Serrano once said, "A woman of color doesn't face racism and sexism separately. The sexism she faces is often racialized, and the racism she faces is often sexualized." This truth began to feel personal to me. One day, this same professor went off on a tangent about how important it is for everyone to learn Greek and Hebrew, as it changes the way we read and teach Scripture. It seemed to me that he really was speaking only to the men in the class when he finished his speech with, "And ladies, your husbands will be really impressed if you can exegete Scripture alongside them." My heart sank. I was stunned that he would imply I was going through the effort of learning the biblical languages simply to impress my spouse. I nearly fell off my chair when he ended by asking, "Right, Kat?" I was one of the outspoken students in class. The mujeres, the women in my culture, taught me to be that way, to be confident, to speak up, to work hard. I carried this with me in seminary. Not only did I debate theology, exegete Scripture, and have an educated opinion alongside my male peers, but I also spent just as much of my personal time studying as they did. And according to my professor, it was not to eventually lead the church, but to impress my spouse. At this point, I had already begun my in-depth study of women in Scripture. I had already learned about the household codes, women leaders in the Bible, the context from which Paul spoke, and a myriad of other details that convinced me that God had uniquely called me and empowered me to lead, to use my gifts and my talents, and to do so from the strength of my abuela, my grandmother, my mom, and the cloud of antepasadas before them. Through my study of Scripture, I had learned that God didn't make a mistake in creating me a woman, and God surely didn't make a mistake in creating me a Cuban woman.